There is a rule in the deep forests of Indonesia that has survived longer than any map, any road, any government. It has been passed down for generations, whispered from one guide to the next, long before any of them were born. It has nothing to do with wild animals. It has nothing to do with the terrain or the rivers or the things that can bite you in the dark. The rule is simpler than that, and that is exactly what makes it so disturbing. Never answer when something calls your name from inside the forest. That is the whole rule. Forwards. And the reason it still terrifies people today is that some of them didn't listen. Some of them walked toward the voice anyway. And some of them never walked back out. This is one of those stories. The forests of Borneo stretch for hundreds of miles, a green ocean so dense that sunlight barely touches the ground by midday. The indigenous communities who live along its edges know it better than anyone alive, and they know something else too. They know where the boundary is between the forest that welcomes you and the forest that does not. Ask any of them why the rule exists, and you will get a different answer every time. Some say it is the forest defending itself. Some say it is something older than the forest. Nobody agrees on what it is. What they do agree on is what happens if you break the rule. This account comes from testimony passed between search volunteers, forest guides, and residents of a village near the tree line. The kind of story that spreads locally long before anyone from the outside ever hears it. There is no way to verify every detail, but enough people tell the same version in the same order with the same fear in their voice that it has become something the whole region treats as fact rather than folklore. It started with a missing man. He had gone into the forest alone to search for agar wood, the fragrant resin that sells for enormous sums to collectors overseas, the kind of harvest that can support a family for months if you find the right tree. He knew the forest well. He had done this before. When he didn't return by nightfall, his family assumed he had simply misjudged the distance and made camp somewhere inside. When he didn't return the next morning either, they knew something was wrong. By the second day, a search team had been organized. A mix of local residents who knew the terrain and volunteers who had come from nearby towns to help. They split into a loose formation and began moving through the undergrowth, calling his name every few minutes, listening for a response that never came. The forest around them thickened as they went deeper, and the daylight began fading faster than it should have, the canopy above swallowing what little sun was left. Their radio started cutting in and out, bursts of static replacing whole sentences. The lead guide gave one instruction before they moved further in. Stay within sight of each other. No exceptions. They had been walking for almost 3 hours when the first sound reached them, drifting up from a low valley to their left. A voice, faint, human. It said one word: help. Every member of the team stopped where they stood. Nobody spoke. They waited, straining to hear it again, and for a long moment there was nothing but wind moving through leaves overhead. Then it came again, 5 minutes later, closer this time and clearer. One of the volunteers was almost certain it was the missing man's voice. He took a step toward the sound before the local guide grabbed his arm and stopped him cold. If that's really him, the guide said, he'll answer with a whistle. Everyone carries one for exactly this reason. Don't follow the voice. Wait for the whistle. No whistle came, only the voice, calling out again, weaker but unmistakably present, somewhere in the dark just ahead of them. One of the older volunteers, a man who had spent years working the edges of that forest, pulled the group leader aside and said something that stuck with everyone who heard it afterward. He said the forest doesn't lie about direction, but voices do. Sound bounces off trunks, off rock faces, off the canopy itself, and a call that seems to come from 30 feet ahead could just as easily be coming from somewhere behind you, or from nowhere at all. He said his grandfather taught him that the only voice you can ever fully trust in that forest is your own, because everything else might be borrowing a shape it was never meant to have. Nobody wanted to say what they were all starting to think. That the voice wasn't lost, that it was leading, that should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Within the next hour, the voice changed. It stopped saying help. It started saying a name, and not just any name. It was calling out the name of one of the team members directly, over and over, in a tone that sounded almost pleading. The strange part wasn't that it knew his name. The strange part was the direction. Every time the group adjusted their position to move away from the sound, the voice seemed to follow, always staying just out of view, always sounding closer than it had a moment before. And yet nobody ever saw a single figure between the trees. Not a shadow, not a movement in the brush, nothing. Then the compass needle started spinning, not drifting, not settling somewhere off true north the way it might near an old mineral deposit. Spinning slow and continuous, as though something invisible was circling the group at close range. The radios gave up entirely around the same time, producing nothing but a flat wall of static no matter what channel they tried. A few of the younger volunteers started to lose their composure. One of them admitted afterward that his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his flashlight steady, and that every time he raised it toward the sound, the beam only ever landed on empty space between the trunks, as if whatever was speaking had learned to stay exactly one step outside the light. The guide called for the group to stop moving entirely. "Stand still," he said. "Don't call back. Don't move toward it, don't move away from it, just wait." For almost 10 minutes nobody moved, and the voice kept calling the same name into the dark, patient in a way that no lost, injured, terrified person calling for rescue has any reason to be. It never grew tired. It never grew desperate. It simply repeated itself, evenly, like something reciting a word it had, memorized without understanding what it meant. And then the man whose name had been called did the one thing every guide in that region had spent a lifetime warning people never to do. He stepped toward the voice. 1 second he was standing at the edge of the group, and the next he had pushed forward into the tree line, disappearing behind a wall of trunks before anyone could grab him. The team broke into a run, crashing through undergrowth in the direction he had gone, shouting his name now instead of the missing man's. And for almost a full minute there was no answer of any kind. They found him standing motionless at the edge of a ravine, close enough to the drop that another half step forward would have ended everything. He wasn't looking at them when they reached him. He was staring straight ahead into empty air, and when they finally got him to speak, what he said made everyone go quiet. He told them the missing man had been standing directly in front of him the entire time, close enough to touch, calling his name without stopping. He described his face. He described what he was wearing. Every other person in that group had been looking at the exact same spot, and every single one of them swears there was nothing there. No man, no shape, just trees and dark and the edge of a cliff that could have killed him in an instant. Hours later, the actual missing man was found alive, almost 2 kilometers from that ravine, in the opposite direction the voice had been leading them. He was exhausted, dehydrated, barely able to stand, and he told them something that didn't fit with anything they had experienced that night. He said he had never called for help. He couldn't have. He'd lost his voice from the heat and the exertion hours before the team ever entered the forest. He hadn't made a sound in hours, let alone called anyone's name. Nobody can say for certain what the search team actually heard that night. Some believe it was nothing more than exhaustion and the acoustics of a forest that can bend and scatter sound across impossible distances, turning wind and running water into something that resembles a human voice, if you're tired enough and scared enough to want to hear one. Others believe it is exactly why the old rule still exists, why every guide in that region tells newcomers the same 4 words before they ever set foot past the tree line. Never answer a voice calling your name if you cannot see where it's coming from, because out there, one wrong step off the path doesn't just cost you time, it can cost you everything. Whatever the explanation really is, the rule hasn't gone anywhere. Guides still repeat it to every group they lead, generation after generation, long after the original story has faded into something closer to legend than fact. Not because they know exactly what waits behind that voice in the dark, but because they've seen, more than once, exactly how easily someone disappears the moment they decide to follow it.